Hello, I apologize for the delay in posting this PowerPoint, but it is probably one of the lectures that I would least want to flip just because it's full of information and it's full of terminology, but we will give it a try. So this lecture is going to cover the nervous system and what you might see if there is injury or disease, and I broke it into parts. Central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and just within that, we talk about the sensory motor pathways, and then finally the vestibular system. So the way I've organized this is to just take the nervous system from the top to the bottom, literally and physically, because when I read chapter 12, it this is what it came to. This is how my brain processed all the information that was in chapter 12. And I wondered why it was so difficult to keep everything straight. And the reason it's difficult to keep everything in a linear fashion is because the nervous system is not linear. So here's a blow up of what I did. And so you can see how I'm like Doc from Back to the Future when it comes to this, but this is what I'm saving you from by doing the lecture instead. So the basic thing that is true is that the nervous system is just pathways and connections, kind of like an interchange on a freeway. It's very complex, very interconnected, and it's just a super highway of information that gets transported all over the nervous system and out into the periphery. And it goes through very receives a lot of input, organizes it, and makes a motor response. So just like with a freeway, any kind of damage or any kind of slowing anywhere is going to affect function in the whole system. So the central nervous system is basically the cerebrum, the hemispheres, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and the brainstem, which is located right there. So this is to just show you the view of the brain, so you could see the lobes. The things in the boxes that I have here are to show you that some of the symptoms you could see if those particular lobes of the brain are injured. At the very bottom, where the limbic system is actually deep to the temporal lobe, but damage to the limbic system can cause memory and behavioral issues. So I just wanted to show you some examples of damage to the cerebrum. So the function of the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, cerebral hemispheres, is that it initiates voluntary movement. So it's not the prefrontal cortex, but we're talking about the whole frontal lobe. And damage to that will cause what's called an upper motor neuron pathology. And you would see that in shaken baby syndrome, cerebral palsy, and with just traumatic brain injury. And this picture, the one on the left, is actually of a child that was shaken. You can see that whitish injury there on the left side. And the other x-ray is of the same child, and you can note that gray matter is missing, and there's some ventricular enlargement as well, which means you're having less gray matter. So this child obviously is going to have cognitive delays or cognitive function problems, and because the damage could be into the motor part of the cortex, that there could be some physical disabilities too. And so commonly with the upper motor neuron lesion, there's weakness, spasticity, hyperactive deep tendon reflexes, and generally no atrophy. And fasciculation is just a lot of motor irregular motor movement. So they do not demonstrate that. So if you think of a child with cerebral palsy, we think about spasticity, and I think generally with children that I have worked with shaken baby syndrome, they just feel very, very, I don't know, floppy would be the best word. So this is a child that has actually the brain on the left is a normal child's brain, and you can see where the gray matter is. But if you look to the right, this is a child that had a deep brain infarct, actually. So there was a loss of blood flow to specific deep parts of the brain. And so that child has scarring on its gray matter, which means that it causes problems with motor movement. So the next part as we travel down the central nervous system is the cerebellum. And it is it's an interesting little organ. And the more I researched for this, the better I understood it. Um, but its general functions are to uh, create precision movements. They refine and smooth voluntary movements. So as that signal comes through from the frontal lobe, it'll be adjusted accordingly. It monitors our position in space, and it's really important for motor planning, sequencing, and speed and dexterity. So if you think about the Brunics, there are specific items for the speed and dexterity, especially. So uh, injury to the cerebellum or not as good functioning of the cerebellum would cause that. So in addition, I don't know if you can see all the Roman numerals, but that is about where all the cranial nerves uh, come through the cerebellum. And the other thing is to notice is the color, because there are 3 sections of the cerebellum. So it has 3 parts with 3 different functions. The first, we're going to challenge your use of medical term, but the first one is the vestibulocerebellar part, and it is involved in balance and equilibrium reactions, and it coordinates head and eye movements, and we'll get into that further. And it is involved in motor planning. Part 2 is the spinocerebellar area, and that's for timing and successful movement. So it's a support for successful movements, for rapid movements, and to correct unintended movements. So it dampens or I think dampening is the best word. It dampens unintended movement, but it helps to keep the timing of rapid movements and keeps movement in general successful. Okay, so the last part is the cerebrocerebellar area. And so it's involved, obviously, because it's coming from the cerebrum. It is part of that volitional movement and initiating of volitional movement. And it's also involved with motor planning and timing. The brainstem itself is located at the base of the brain, leading to the spinal cord. And it's the thing about the brainstem is it's interconnected with circuits from everywhere, and it is able to use multiple neurotransmitters, so it can interact with a variety of other neurons. Its basic function is life-sustaining, for it kind of automatically takes care of the heart, the lungs, and temperature regulation. But it also supports voluntary movement. And within the brainstem is the basal ganglia, which has 4 units. The 4 extrapyramidal nuclei, which means that it runs outside the pyramidal tract, is that it has 2 motor circuits, and it's for assuring success of complex movement. So it's supports, it's like a support function, as well as oculomotor control. It has an association circuit, which helps it establish memories, which means it interacts with the amygdala. And it has one limbic function that helps to regulate motivation and emotion. So again, it's part of the hippocampus. So it interacts with a large variety of other major systems. So there are pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. We just talked about the extrapyramidal ones, and the pyramidal tracts, they cross at a pyramidal decussation. And the reason that's important to you is because the green area denotes where that decussation or crossing takes place, which is why in someone like with a CVI who has a left brain injury will have symptoms of loss of motor control on the right side of their body. So that's what's significant about that pyramidal decussation. So the four extrapyramidal tracts are the reticulospinal, the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal. And if you look at what they do, part of the importance of the reticulospinal tract is it goes through the RAS or reticular activating system, which helps to control consciousness and also focus. So it can alter muscle tone relative to the level of consciousness. And in an alert state, it helps to increase extension. And in a more sleepy state or being asleep, it can increase flexion. So it acts on the muscles of the trunk and proximal limbs. And the RAS helps it to filter stimuli and focus on what we are thinking about. So let's say a child has ADD. Could it possibly be a malfunction or misfunction of the reticulospinal tract or some component of it? So the rubrospinal tract goes through something called the red nucleus, and it is in charge of fine motor control and dexterity. Vestibulospinal, so our friend the vestibular system, it helps respond to gravity and movement, and it also increases tone. And the tectospinal, it initiates reflexive orienting to auditory and visual stimuli. So when you hear something and you turn your head toward the stimuli, that is actually your tectospinal tract that's working. So the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, includes all the nerves that lie outside the brain and spinal cord. And so there are a somatic part of the peripheral nervous system, and it is part of associating with movements, so volitional movement with skeletal muscles. And there are sensory afferents, and they carry information from sensory receptors, the skin, could be taste, could be sound, could be movement, and send it up the ascending pathway to the central nervous system. And when we talk about sensory receptors, there are exteroceptors that give information from outside the body in our environment. And there are interoceptors that come from within the body. So if you have pain in a certain area, that would be an interoceptor sending that message to your central nervous system. And then in the descending tract, that's the motor efferents. And they carry information from the central nervous system out to the muscles so that the person can make an adaptive response or respond to the sensory stimulation it received. And then the other part of the PNS is the autonomic nervous system, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. And it is intimately connected to the hypothalamus, which regulates the release of hormones, regulates temperature, controls appetite, and regulates your circadian rhythms. So it also mediates emotional responses. So if you have a child, and it happens often, where their sleep-wake pattern is off, and they might have intense emotional outbursts, that they may have something that's going on, or more sensitive autonomic nervous system. And particularly those children you'll see operate more on their sympathetic nervous system, which is fight and flight. And what it does is it prepares the body for threat. And basically what happens is all the circulation from the central part of the body goes out to the extremities. And so it can create, if it happens a lot, or that's generally the state that a child is in, it can cause a lot of problems, especially with the gut, because it stops normal digestion. And you see a lot of children who get their chief complaint with their parent is they're constipated. But the parasympathetic system, which we all have, it takes care of the normal functions of the body while we're resting and recuperating. So it's kind of our nervous system of homeostasis. So the peripheral nervous system consists of lower motor neurons, or LMNs, and the cranial nerves. The reasons that you could have injury to the PNS would be obstetric brachial plexus injury or Erb's palsy. They're sort of interchangeable. And disorder of anything that is innervated by the cranial nerves. And symptoms could be flaccid muscles, paralysis, hypoactive deep tendon reflexes, and fasciculations, which are involuntary random movements. And a person, because we're talking cranial nerves, could have difficulty in swallowing and with speech and other consequences related to the cranial nerve that's involved. And then this results in muscle atrophy as well. So I have some examples. This is Erb's palsy, and it's caused by the brachial plexus injury during birth. And this is kind of the characteristic posture here. So it'll require therapy, obviously, to address and hopefully improve motor function in those hands. And this is an example of when cranial nerve 3 on the left side is damaged. It's an ocular motor nerve, which is why the child does not have control over his eyelid, and he probably doesn't have motion over all the movements of his left eye. And this is an example of the hypoglossal nerve, or cranial nerve 9, and it will lead to weakness in the tongue, and you can kind of see even a different sort of pattern there because the muscles aren't innervated properly. Okay, we talked about the interoceptors and we talked about exteroceptors already. But our silent superhero is the vestibular system, which consists of the semicircular canals and the cochlear complex in both our ears. And I admire him greatly after all these years because the vestibular nuclei, the brainstem houses all of them, or most of them, and there's some also deep in the cerebral hemispheres. And it exchanges information from the cerebellum and the semicircular canals and the eyes, the oculomotor, as well as movements of the head, and then general posture. So the vestibular nuclei get information from both ears, and what it basically does is compares the information relative to the movement of the head. And then many vestibular nuclei also receive proprioceptive signals from the muscles in the body, muscles and joints in the body. So it's kind of like connected to all the major things that help. The other important thing about the vestibular system is its connection to the limbic system, which manages emotion and motivation. And it's so it's such a powerful connection that there's been a lot of research done on how the vestibular stimulation can improve mood in people who are depressed or anxious. And the reason I think it is capable of that is because it takes all the sensors from the body and integrates it, which is why sensory integration is called what it is, because it uses all the sensory information from all the system to tell our body where we are in space and the location of our parts in relation to one another. Like, you know that if you flex your shoulder to 180 degrees, that your hand is going to be above your shoulder and above your elbow. And you're informed that way by in part by your vestibular system. And it really does help us to define what is us and what is not us. It separates so we know where we are and what parts of us are really us and what is the environment or not us. So the major sense organs of the vestibular system are in the inner ear. They are the semicircular canals, and they're oriented to detect all planes of movement. So your laterals rotate side to side, and forward and back is, think about this, anterior, and then your posterior canals detect side to side motion, tipping your head side to side. Any movement causes the fluid that is within those semicircular canals to move. And what happens is they move those receptors within the canal and causing them to either fire or be inhibited. So I have a pretty good video of that. That's next. So you can watch that. And then the receptors are the ampulla and the crista ampullaris. And that gives information about rotation. So if you're nodding, then it's the ampulla and the crista ampullaris that's providing that information. And then the utricle and the saccule are two different little sacs that are kind of in the vestibule of, so like the common place of where the semicircular canals and the cochlea sort of meet. But the utricle and saccule are oriented at different angles, right angles to each other, so that it gives information about the speed and direction of linear movement of the head or the whole body. So like if you were sitting in a car zoomed off so your head tipped back. Eventually, inertia, it'll catch up and then it tells your body that your body's in line with your head again. So there's a really good video. This is a great video about that. So I invite you to watch that. And then the other thing I want to talk about is what's called post-rotational nystagmus. And it is a normal response to rapid rotational movement. And it's caused because of that endolymph inside the semicircular canals continues to move after the movement has stopped. And eventually that nystagmus or eye movement will change. And the duration can indicate a normal or atypical response simply by the presence or absence, its presence or absence, or the length, how long it takes for the eyes to recover from the nystagmus. So, in fact, let's watch this guy. I hope. Maybe not. So I encourage you to watch those videos when we're done. So this is a drawing of all the different parts, because there's a bony labyrinth. Within it is a membranous labyrinth, and within that is the endolymph. And these expansions are where the ampulla is, excuse me. And then the utricle and saccule are here and here. And remember, their receptors are at 90-degree angles to one another. And this is just an expanded view. It's kind of, and you can see here now where the saccule is kind of vertical, whereas the macula is more horizontal. Then you can see the crista ampullaris, which is within here, the ampulla. And what else can we see? Oh, the hair cells are actually the receptors. So when this ampulla actually doesn't allow the endolymph to move through or past it, so what it does, it will displace this and push it. And then what happens is these hair cells will lean one way, which activates or inhibits these cells from these nerve fibers from firing. And this is within the macula. This is within the ampulla. And they are oriented just differently, and they have a kinocilium, which is the longest, and the stereocilia are smaller. So when movement causes the cells to displace, same like the ampulla, they will fire or not fire. And this is like a gelatin, like I think of it as like licorice inside of jello, and on top of it is like these calcium carbonate crystals or otoconia. And because of their relative weight, when the endolymph displaces this, the weight of the otoconia will move this gel-like substance, which then makes the hair cells fire. It's a complicated little thing. So one of the things that comes with the vestibular system being connected very much so to the eyes is called the vestibular ocular reflex. And it is to stabilize a visual image on the retina in the fovea specifically, which is the focal point, in response to movement of the head. So we will try this in class because you have to have somebody you can observe in order to see the VOR. So basically what happens is you sit in front of your partner, have your partner focus on a point in the distance. So not looking at you, they're looking up at a point past you. And then you're going to have them turn their head to the left or right while maintaining their focus on that distance point. And then I'm going to have you pay attention to what exactly happened to their eyes, because the mechanics of it is that the vestibular system and that the extraocular muscles and their innervation, which is probably the ocular motor cranial nerve, are talking and exchanging information that makes certain muscles of the eye relax and the other muscles contract to get the movement that you see. So we'll do that in class though. And there are 3 kinds of movements of the eyes. There are saccades, which is small, and they call them ballistic eye movements, which I kind of don't understand. But they're movements that change abruptly because what is happening is the eyes are focusing on a point and then quickly moving to another focus point. So like while you're reading, even though you're reading across the page, what happens to your eyes is it'll make a quick movement and then stabilize the image. Smooth pursuit movements would be when you're following an object in space with just your eyes. And you don't need to move your head in order to do that. You actually just use your oculomotor muscles to do that. And then there are conjugate eye movements. Conjugate eye movements means that the eyes are working together. And you need conjugate eye movements for activities like reading and writing. And there's two types of conjugate eye movements, and we've all done them. And then your mom says, do you want your eyes to get stuck that way? So the way you do, when you think of convergence, you think of the eyes, both eyes coming to midline. So they, to center. So that's where you'd have your finger at arm's length. And then as you watch your finger come toward your nose, your two eyes will converge, move together toward the center. And the opposite of convergence is divergence. And so what that would entail is if you were focused on your finger that was on your nose and you slowly moved it out, your eyes would then move off the midline and be straight, but they do it together. So these are basically the YouTube videos, some that I've embedded in the PowerPoint, but it helps you to see the semicircular, or excuse me, how this vestibular system works. I think it's the best way to see how the system works. But I did include 2 videos with activities that help you stimulate either the right semicircular canals or the left, because I wanted you to see the direction of the movements that this chiropractor actually demonstrates, so you can get a sense of how the canals are oriented in your head. And here's just a couple of the resources and our friend Super Vestibular Man. I'm hoping this gives you in a nutshell what the vestibular system does. Chapter 12 is your savior on this one. And I will make up an LSA that is going to be more like catching the points that I want you to get from this lecture. And like I said, we're going to cover the exercises in class because I think that's important to do. So thanks for listening and thanks for your patience.